I hired a woman to clean the house while my whole family was out. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text. It was a photo from the cleaning lady, slightly blurry, taken from a low angle. The message read, "There's someone in your house." My blood ran cold. The photograph showed our upstairs hallway, the one I'd walked down thousands of times in the 43 years David and I had lived in this house. But there, barely visible in the shadows near our daughter Sarah's bedroom door, was the unmistakable silhouette of a man. A stranger, standing perfectly still, as if he belonged there. My hands started shaking so violently I nearly dropped the phone. I was sitting in the parking lot of Riverside Elementary, where I'd just finished tutoring little Emma Rodriguez with her reading comprehension. The autumn sun was streaming through my windshield, and I remember thinking how normal everything looked. Other parents picking up their children, the crossing guard waving at familiar faces, the everyday rhythm of a Tuesday afternoon that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I typed back with fingers that wouldn't stop trembling. "Get out. Now. Don't go upstairs. Leave everything and get out." Then I called 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained to the dispatcher that there was an intruder in my home and my cleaning lady was trapped inside with him. "Ma'am, is anyone in immediate danger?" the dispatcher asked in that maddeningly calm voice they're trained to use. "Yes," I wanted to scream. "There's a stranger in my house and a 25-year-old girl who's probably terrified out of her mind." If stories like this keep you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to our channel for more real-life mysteries that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about the people closest to you. I pressed the accelerator harder than I had in years, racing through suburban Portland streets that I'd driven safely for decades. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every turn brought me closer to a house that suddenly felt like foreign territory, a place where strangers could apparently materialize in hallways where my children had taken their first steps, where David and I had built what I thought was an unshakable life. You have to understand why this felt like such a violation. I'd hired Chloe Martinez through a service my neighbor recommended, a young woman working her way through community college supporting her mother and younger sister. She was supposed to do a deep clean while the house was empty, preparing for Sarah's engagement party this weekend. 40 of our closest friends and family members were coming to celebrate my youngest daughter's upcoming marriage, and I wanted everything perfect. David was at his weekly golf game at Riverside Country Club, the same foursome he'd played with every Tuesday for 15 years. Our oldest son, Michael, was at his law firm downtown, and Sarah was pulling a double shift at the hospital where she works as a pediatric nurse. I'd scheduled the cleaning specifically for today because it was the one day I knew everyone would be gone for hours. I was supposed to be tutoring until 4 o'clock, then stopping by the florist to confirm the arrangements for the party. Instead, I was speeding home to face God knows what, with sirens wailing in the distance. Sirens that were going to my house, my sanctuary, the place where I'd felt safest in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me as I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. I'm a retired high school English teacher. I spent 35 years teaching teenagers about dramatic irony, about how characters and stories are often the last to see the truth that's right in front of them. But nothing had prepared me for the moment when my own life became the story where nothing was what it seemed. As I turned onto Maple Street and saw the police cars already in my driveway, their red and blue lights painting my rose garden in surreal colors, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my safe, predictable life was about to change forever. The worst part? I had no idea that the real shock wasn't the stranger in my house. It was discovering that the person I thought I knew best in the world had been lying to me for longer than I could have imagined. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I had to face what was waiting for me behind my own front door, and the terrified young woman who'd seen something that would unravel 45 years of marriage in ways I never could have predicted. I pulled into my driveway behind 2 police cruisers, their lights still flashing like a beacon announcing to the entire neighborhood that something was terribly wrong at the Patterson house. Officer Martinez, no relation to Chloe I learned later, was already taking notes on his pad as I stumbled out of my car on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. Chloe was sitting on my front porch steps, wrapped in what I recognized as the throw blanket from our living room sofa. Her dark hair had escaped its ponytail, and mascara streaks ran down her cheeks like she'd been crying for the better part of an hour. When she saw me, she jumped to her feet with a kind of urgency that told me everything I needed to know about how real this was. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry. I should have called you sooner, but I was so scared I could barely think straight." Officer Martinez looked up from his notepad with the expression of someone who'd already made up his mind about what had happened here. "Ma'am, we've done a complete sweep of the house. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone unauthorized has been inside. All doors and windows are secure." But Chloe shook her head with the kind of desperate insistence that comes from knowing you've seen something real, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. "I saw a man, Mrs. Patterson. He was just standing in the hallway upstairs, maybe 10 feet from your daughter's bedroom door. He was tall, probably in his 60s, wearing a dark sweater. He didn't see me. I was coming up from the laundry room in the basement, and I saw him through the banister slats." She pulled out her phone with hands that were still trembling. "I hid behind the laundry room door and took the picture. I was too scared to move, too scared to make any noise. He just stood there for maybe 2 minutes, staring into that bedroom like he was looking for something specific." The photograph on Chloe's phone was grainy and taken from a low angle, but there was definitely a human silhouette in our upstairs hallway. The figure was partially obscured by shadows, but you could make out the shape of a person standing motionless near Sarah's door. The room that still held her childhood memories, her high school trophies, the white desk where she'd studied for her nursing boards. "Where did he leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Chloe admitted. "I stayed hidden for maybe 10 minutes after I sent you the text. When I finally got brave enough to look again, he was gone. I ran outside and called the police from your front yard. I was too scared to go back in." Officer Martinez cleared his throat with the kind of diplomatic patience that suggested he'd dealt with situations like this before. "Mrs. Patterson, we've checked every room, every closet, the basement, the attic. There's no one here. Is it possible that shadows from the trees outside, or maybe a reflection from one of the mirrors upstairs, could have created the illusion of a person?" That's when David arrived. I heard his Mercedes pull into the driveway with its usual quiet precision, and somehow his presence immediately changed the entire atmosphere of the scene. David Patterson has always had that effect, the ability to walk into chaos and restore order simply by being himself. 45 years of marriage to a high school principal, and I'd seen him diffuse everything from teenage riots to parent-teacher conferences that had devolved into shouting matches. He emerged from his car still wearing his golf clothes, navy polo shirt, khaki slacks, and those expensive shoes he insisted were necessary for his game. At 70, David still carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room, and his calm demeanor immediately made everyone else feel like they might be overreacting. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying just the right note of concern without panic. Officer Martinez explained the situation while David listened with the kind of focused attention that had made him an effective administrator for 30 years. When the officer finished, David walked over to Chloe with the gentle authority he'd once used with students who'd gotten themselves into trouble. "Chloe, I'm sure this was terrifying for you," he said, his voice warm with understanding. "But this is a very old house, built in 1887. The way light filters through those stained glass windows on the staircase landing creates shadows that can look remarkably like human figures, especially if you're not familiar with the patterns." He gestured toward our front windows, where the late afternoon sun was indeed casting long, strange shadows across the porch. "My wife and I have lived here for over 4 decades, and I can't tell you how many times one of us has been startled by what we thought was a person, only to realize it was the shadow of the oak tree moving across Sarah's mirror, or the way the light hits that antique wardrobe." David's explanation was so reasonable, so logical, that I found myself wanting to believe it. The alternative, that a stranger had somehow been in our house, in our private space, was too disturbing to fully accept, and David knew this house better than anyone. He'd restored most of it himself, spent countless weekends working on the Victorian details that made it so beautiful and so full of unexpected shadows. But Chloe wasn't convinced. "Mr. Patterson, I know what I saw. It wasn't a shadow, it was a person. He moved slightly while I was watching him. Shadows don't move like that." David smiled with the kind of patient understanding that made you feel both heard and gently corrected at the same time. "I'm sure it seemed very real to you, but fear has a way of making our minds fill in details that aren't actually there. You were alone in an unfamiliar house, probably a little on edge already. It's completely understandable that your mind would interpret shadows and light as something more threatening." The police left 20 minutes later, satisfied with David's explanation and my apparent calm acceptance of it. I paid Chloe for the time she'd worked, plus extra for the trauma she'd experienced. But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe David's shadow theory any more than she had when he'd first suggested it. "Mrs. Patterson," she said quietly as she gathered her cleaning supplies, "I know what I saw. Please be careful." After she left, David and I stood in our living room, the same room where we'd celebrated anniversaries and Christmas mornings, where we'd helped our children with homework and hosted dinner parties. But for the first time in 43 years, it didn't feel entirely safe. "You don't really think someone was in our house, do you, Eleanor?" David asked, his voice carrying just a hint of the concern that any reasonable husband would feel if his wife was starting to believe in intruders that didn't exist. I looked at him, this man I'd loved and trusted for almost half a century, and realized I didn't know what to believe anymore. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was already starting to grow in ways that would change everything between us. "No," I heard myself say, "of course not." Chloe was just scared. But even as I said the words, I knew I was lying, and somewhere deep in my mind, I was beginning to wonder if David was lying too. The strange incident started 3 days after Chloe's encounter, small enough that I might have dismissed them individually, but together, they created a pattern that made my skin crawl every time I walked through my own house. The first thing I noticed was our smart home system. David had installed it 2 years ago, one of those comprehensive setups that monitors doors, windows, even tells you when the refrigerator door has been left open too long. I'd grown used to checking the app on my phone each morning, a little ritual that made me feel secure knowing our house had been safely sealed while we slept. That Thursday morning, the log showed our back door had opened at 3:17 a.m. and closed again 4 minutes later. I stared at the phone screen while making my morning coffee, reading and rereading the timestamp. David was at the kitchen table with his newspaper, the same spot he'd occupied every morning for 43 years, looking completely untroubled by anything more serious than the sports scores. "David," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "the security system shows the back door opened in the middle of the night. Did you go outside for some reason?" He looked up from the paper with mild annoyance, the expression he got when technology interfered with his orderly world. "Honey, that system's been glitchy ever since the last software update. I keep meaning to call the company, but you know how these things are. They'll want to send a technician who'll charge us $200 to reset something we could probably fix ourselves." His explanation was perfectly reasonable. The system had been acting up lately. Phantom alerts about windows that weren't actually open, motion sensors triggered by our cat jumping onto furniture. But something about his tone bothered me, the way he dismissed my concern without even looking at the phone to see what I was talking about. The second incident happened that weekend. I was getting ready for Sarah's engagement party, trying to create the perfect playlist for the evening, when I opened Spotify on my iPad and found something that made my blood run cold. Someone had created a new playlist on my account called Memories. It contained 37 songs, all from the 1970s ballads and love songs from artists I barely recognized. The Way You Look Tonight by Tony Bennett, Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers, Can't Help Myself by the Four Tops. Songs that belonged to a different generation, a different life than mine. I'd never created this playlist. I barely knew how to create playlists on Spotify, relying on the app's suggestions or David's teenage grandson to help me when I wanted something specific. But there it was, meticulously curated, as if someone had spent hours selecting songs that meant something deeply personal to them. "David," I called from my bedroom, my voice sharp with confusion. "Did you make a playlist on my Spotify account?" He appeared in the doorway, adjusting his tie for the party. "What's a playlist?" "That's David Dunay, a brilliant man who can rebuild a Victorian house from the foundation up, but claims he can't understand how to work a smartphone app." I showed him the playlist, and he suggested it was probably some algorithm mistake, something about Spotify's artificial intelligence creating content based on my listening history. "You know how these apps crosswire with each other," he said with that patient tone that made me feel like a confused child. "Remember when your Amazon account started recommending cat food, even though we don't have a cat? Same thing. But we'd had a cat until 6 months ago. Whiskers had been 17 when we finally had to put him down. And I'd been buying cat food on Amazon for years." David's comparison didn't make sense, but he said it with such confidence that I found myself doubting my own memory of our pet ownership history. The third incident was the one that finally convinced me I wasn't imagining things, even though it was also the one that made me question my own sanity most deeply. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Chloe's encounter. I came downstairs to make breakfast and found a coffee mug in the sink still containing about half an inch of cold, black coffee. The ceramic was one of our good mugs, part of the wedding china set my mother had given us 45 years ago. Neither David nor I drink coffee. We're both dedicated tea drinkers, have been since before we were married. Our kitchen contains exactly one coffee-making device, a dusty old percolator that belongs to our son Michael, left behind from his college years and never reclaimed. I keep it in the back of a cabinet behind the serving platters we use twice a year. I stood at the sink holding that mug, staring at the dark residue like it was evidence of a crime. My hands were shaking again, the same tremor I'd felt when Chloe's text arrived, because this wasn't something that could be explained by shadows or software glitches or algorithmic mistakes. Someone had been in our kitchen, someone had made coffee in our house, someone had used our good china and left evidence of their presence like a calling card. "David!" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended, carrying an edge of hysteria that I immediately regretted. He appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing his morning bathrobe, looking concerned by my tone. "What's wrong, Eleanor?" I held up the mug like I was presenting evidence in a trial. "This was in the sink. Someone made coffee." David's expression went through several changes: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like recognition, before settling into patient understanding. "Oh, that," he said with a slightly embarrassed smile. I couldn't sleep last night, kept tossing and turning, thinking about the Henderson contract. Around 2:30, I decided maybe some caffeine would help me stay awake until I got tired enough to actually fall asleep. I know it sounds backwards, but sometimes it works. I stared at my husband of 45 years, the man who had never, in all our time together, voluntarily consumed a cup of coffee. David Patterson despises coffee. He claims it tastes like burned dirt, makes jokes about people who need artificial stimulation to face the morning, takes pride in being naturally alert without chemical assistance. But he was standing in our kitchen in his familiar blue bathrobe, explaining why he'd made coffee in the middle of the night with the same reasonable tone he'd used to explain the security system glitch and the mysterious playlist. "Since when do you drink coffee?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't, usually. That's why I only managed to drink half of it. Reminded me why I stick to tea." He took the mug from my hands with gentle authority. "I should have rinsed it out, but I was half asleep. Sorry if it worried you." That afternoon, I found myself doing something I'd never done in 45 years of marriage. I searched our house like I was looking for evidence of infidelity. Not another woman, but another presence. Someone who knew our routines well enough to move through our home without detection. someone who felt comfortable enough to make coffee and create playlists and open doors in the middle of the night. I checked every room, every closet, every corner where someone might hide or leave traces of their existence. I found nothing obvious, but small things seemed wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. My high school yearbook, usually buried in a box in our bedroom closet, was sitting on my nightstand. A locket that had belonged to my mother, typically hidden in my jewelry box, was prominently displayed on the dresser as if someone had been examining it. When I mentioned these discoveries to David, he suggested I might have moved them myself while looking for something else and simply forgotten. We're getting older, dear. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us. The gaslighting was so subtle, so perfectly executed, that I began to question everything I thought I knew about my own memory, my own perceptions, my own sanity. But there was one thing David couldn't explain away, one piece of evidence that would eventually unravel his carefully constructed deception. Chloe's photograph was still on my phone, and I found myself studying it obsessively, zooming in on different sections, trying to see details that might have been missed in the initial panic. Late at night, while David slept beside me, I would enhance the lighting and adjust the contrast, searching for something that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. And finally, buried in the shadows of that blurry image, I found it, the one detail that would change everything and reveal the truth David had been hiding in plain sight for longer than I could have imagined. But discovering the truth and confronting it are two very different things, and I was about to learn that sometimes the people who claim to protect us are the ones we most need protection from. For 2 weeks, I carried that photograph around like a talisman, pulling it up on my phone at random moments throughout the day. While David was in the shower, I'd study it. During commercial breaks while we watched the evening news, I'd zoom in on different sections. In the middle of sleepless nights, I'd enhance the lighting and adjust the contrast until my eyes burned from staring at the screen. I'd memorized every shadow, every angle, every detail of our upstairs hallway, captured in that grainy image. The way the afternoon light filtered through Sarah's bedroom window, the familiar pattern of our vintage wallpaper, the antique table runner I'd inherited from David's mother, draped across the small table outside our guest bathroom. But it was Tuesday night, October 17th, I remember the date because it was exactly 3 weeks after Chloe's encounter, when I finally saw what had been hiding in plain sight all along. I was lying in bed at 2:30 a.m., unable to sleep because of the sound David was making. Not quite snoring, but a rhythmic breathing that seemed different somehow, deeper than usual. He'd claimed he was getting a cold, taking some new medication that made him drowsy, but something about his sleep seemed too profound, too complete, like he was unconscious rather than simply resting. I picked up my phone and opened Chloe's photograph for what must have been the 100th time, but this time I focused on the background details rather than the mysterious figure. That's when I noticed something on Sarah's nightstand that made my heart stop completely. In the far right corner of the image, barely visible in the shadows cast by her bedside lamp, was a prescription bottle. It was sitting exactly where Sarah always kept her water glass, positioned as if someone had been using her room regularly enough to establish their own routine. I zoomed in until the image became pixelated, but I could just make out text on the bottle's label. The pharmacy logo was visible. West Side Pharmacy, the same one our family had used for 20 years. But this wasn't one of our usual prescriptions. The bottle was amber-colored, standard size, with what looked like a recent fill date. My hands were shaking as I enhanced the contrast and increased the brightness, trying to make out the name on the label. The letters were blurry, distorted by the photo's poor quality and extreme magnification, but gradually they became clear enough to read. Robert Patterson. Robert Patterson. David's younger brother, the family failure, the black sheep who disappeared from our lives 5 years ago after a series of business disasters and financial scandals that had embarrassed David beyond description. Robert, who was supposed to be living in Australia, starting over somewhere we'd never have to deal with his problems again. Robert, who apparently had a current prescription filled at our local pharmacy, just 2 weeks after Chloe had photographed a mysterious man standing in our hallway. I felt like I was drowning in revelation. Every strange incident of the past 3 weeks suddenly made perfect sense. The coffee mug, because Robert had always been a coffee drinker. The 1970s playlist, because Robert was 15 years younger than David, and that music belonged to his generation. The moved personal items, because Robert had grown up in this house and knew exactly where we kept our most treasured possessions. I lay there next to my husband, listening to his suspiciously deep breathing, and realized that David hadn't been gaslighting me to protect our marriage or preserve my peace of mind. He'd been lying to me because he was hiding his brother in our house, and my growing suspicion threatened to expose a secret that David was desperate to keep. The security system alerts weren't glitches. They were Robert moving through the house at night when he thought we were asleep. The mysterious playlist wasn't an algorithm error. It was Robert using my Spotify account to listen to music that reminded him of happier times. The coffee mug wasn't David's inexplicable midnight snack. It was evidence that someone else was living in our home. Someone who felt comfortable enough to use our kitchen and leave traces of his presence. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake worried that I was losing my mind, all the moments I'd questioned my own memory and perception because my husband had convinced me I was imagining things. David had watched me spiral into self-doubt and confusion, had actively encouraged my fears about early dementia or psychological instability, all to protect a secret that was literally sleeping under our own roof. But the most chilling realization was this: if Robert had been hiding in our house for weeks or possibly months, that meant David's shocked reaction to Chloe's photograph had been completely fake. He'd known exactly who the mysterious figure was, had probably warned Robert to be more careful about his movements, had orchestrated the entire scene with the police to make it seem like we'd all been victims of a false alarm. I needed proof. Real, undeniable evidence that would force David to stop lying and start explaining. The prescription bottle in Sarah's room was a start, but I needed to find where Robert was actually staying, what kind of arrangement David had made with him, and how long this deception had been going on. I knew David's schedule better than anyone after 45 years of marriage. Every Tuesday and Thursday he played golf with the same group of men he'd known since college. The games lasted exactly 4 hours. He left at noon and returned at 4:30, as reliable as sunrise. That gave me a window of opportunity to search our house thoroughly, systematically, without fear of interruption. Thursday, October 19th, would be my chance to find the truth. David would leave for golf, expecting to return to the same carefully maintained fiction he'd been living for God knows how long. Instead, he'd come home to find his wife armed with evidence of his betrayal and ready to demand answers that he couldn't deflect with reasonable explanations and concerned suggestions about my failing memory. I'd spent 3 weeks being told I was paranoid, confused, possibly mentally unstable. But I wasn't crazy. I was married to a liar who'd been hiding his brother in our home and systematically destroying my confidence in my own perceptions to protect his secret. The photograph that had terrified me 3 weeks ago was about to become the key to unlocking a deception that ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. And David Patterson, the man I'd trusted with 45 years of my life, was about to discover that underestimating your wife's intelligence is a mistake that can destroy everything you think you've built. Robert's prescription bottle was just the beginning. By Thursday afternoon, I intended to know exactly what my husband had been hiding, and why he'd been willing to let me question my own sanity to keep his secret safe. The truth was about to come out, whether David was ready for it or not. Thursday, October 19th dawned gray and drizzly. Typical Portland autumn weather that seemed to mirror the storm brewing inside our house. I watched David prepare for golf with his usual methodical precision, laying out his clothes the night before, checking the weather forecast, packing his clubs with the same ritual he'd followed for 15 years. "I might be a little late today," he said, kissing my cheek with practiced affection. "Jim wants to grab dinner after the game to discuss that investment opportunity we talked about." Another lie, delivered so smoothly that 3 weeks ago I would have accepted it without question. But now I heard the careful preparation in his voice, the way he was establishing an alibi for extended absence. David wasn't planning dinner with Jim. He was giving himself extra time to deal with whatever crisis my growing suspicion might create. I waited exactly 30 minutes after his Mercedes disappeared down Maple Street before I began my investigation. This time, I wasn't looking for vague signs of intrusion or displaced objects. I was hunting for Robert Patterson with the methodical thoroughness of someone who'd spent 35 years teaching teenagers how to research and document evidence. I started with the obvious places: our guest bedroom, the finished basement, the converted attic space that David used as his workshop. Nothing. But as I moved through the house, I began to notice details that 3 weeks of gaslighting had trained me to dismiss. The guest bathroom showed signs of recent use: a towel that was slightly damp, a bar of soap that had been moved from its usual position. The basement had a faint smell of coffee, despite the fact that we never used that space for anything except storage, and in David's workshop, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind a stack of wood planks that David claimed were for future projects, I found a makeshift living area that was clearly being used regularly: an air mattress with rumpled bedding, still warm to the touch, a small camping table with an electric kettle, instant coffee, and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in one of our kitchen towels. Personal belongings were scattered around the space, with the casual disorder of someone who'd been living there for months. Clothes folded in grocery bags, prescription bottles lined up on a makeshift shelf, a small radio tuned to the classical music station that Robert had always preferred. But the most damning evidence was sitting on the camping table like an indictment: a spiral-bound notebook filled with Robert's handwriting, documenting his daily routine in our house with the precision of someone who understood the importance of not getting caught. David leaves for golf at noon Tuesdays and Thursdays. He usually tutors until 4 p.m. Safe to move around upstairs, use kitchen. Remember to avoid the creaky board outside Sarah's room. October 3rd. Close call with cleaning lady. David says he handled it, but E is suspicious. Need to be more careful about staying hidden when strangers are in-house. October 10th. E found coffee mug. David convinced her it was his, but she's not buying it completely. May need to relocate soon. Page after page of entries detailing how my brother-in-law had been living like a ghost in our home, documenting our schedules, noting our habits, planning his movements around our lives with the calculating precision of a professional thief. October 15th, David gave me Eleanor's old yearbook and Mom's locket to look through. Says it helps him remember better times, but I think he's trying to mess with E's head, making her think she's losing her memory. Feels cruel, but David knows what he's doing. The final entry was dated just 2 days ago. David says the prescription bottle was a mistake, getting sloppy because I'm tired of living like a prisoner. E is getting too close to the truth. Time to disappear again. I sat in David's workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a deception so elaborate and heartless that it rewrote 45 years of marriage in a single afternoon. My husband hadn't just been hiding his brother. He'd been actively psychological torturing me to protect that secret, deliberately making me question my sanity to keep Robert's presence hidden. I didn't move anything. I didn't confront Robert, who was apparently somewhere in the house even now. Instead, I carefully photographed every page of the notebook, every detail of the makeshift living area, every piece of evidence that proved David had been lying to me for months. Then I went upstairs, made myself a cup of tea, and sat in our living room to wait for my husband to come home and face what he'd done to our marriage. At 4:45 p.m., I heard David's car in the driveway. Through our front window, I watched him sit in the Mercedes for several minutes, probably checking his phone for messages from Robert about whether it was safe to come inside. The calculating nature of even that simple moment filled me with a rage I'd never experienced in 7 decades of life. David walked through our front door with his usual confident stride, calling out his customary greeting. "Eleanor? How was your day, sweetheart?" "Interesting," I replied from the living room, my voice carrying a tone he'd never heard before. "I spent the afternoon getting to know your brother." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear David's golf cleats stop moving on our hardwood floor, could practically feel his mind racing through possible explanations and damage control strategies. When he appeared in the living room doorway, his face had gone through several expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, resignation. For the first time in 3 weeks, I was looking at my husband's real face instead of the carefully constructed mask he'd been wearing. "Eleanor, I can explain." "Can you?" I interrupted, holding up my phone with the photographs I'd taken. "Can you explain why Robert has been living in our house for months while you convinced me I was losing my mind? Can you explain why you let me believe I was becoming paranoid and forgetful instead of simply telling me the truth?" David's composure cracked completely. The confident authority that had defined our entire relationship crumbled as he realized that his carefully orchestrated deception had finally collapsed. "He had nowhere else to go," David said, his voice carrying a desperation I'd never heard before. "Robert lost everything, Eleanor. The business failed, he owes money to dangerous people. He was literally sleeping in his car when he came to me. So you hid him in our house and let me think I was going crazy?" My voice was getting louder, carrying 45 years of suppressed frustration with David's tendency to make unilateral decisions about our life. "You watched me question my own sanity rather than have an honest conversation about your brother? You would have said no." David's mask was completely gone now, revealing a man who'd been living with crushing guilt and fear for months. "You've always hated Robert. Always thought he was irresponsible and manipulative. If I'd told you he needed help, you would have insisted he find somewhere else to go." "You're absolutely right," I said, standing to face him with a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. "I would have said no, but that was my choice to make, David. This is my house, my life, my marriage. You don't get to decide what I can handle or what I'm allowed to know. And you especially don't get to systematically destroy my confidence in my own mind to cover up your lies. You made me think I was developing dementia, David. You made me afraid of my own perceptions." The man I'd been married to for 45 years stood in our living room looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. And for the first time since Chloe's terrifying text message, I finally knew exactly what I was dealing with. Not an intruder in my house, but a husband who'd been willing to sacrifice my sanity to protect his brother and avoid a difficult conversation. The truth was finally out, but the real question was whether our marriage could survive the damage David had done to protect his secret. The confrontation with David lasted until nearly midnight. What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in 45 years of marriage. Brutal, necessary, and ultimately transformative, in ways neither of us had expected. Robert emerged from the basement around 8 o'clock, drawn by the sound of raised voices and the realization that his months of hiding were finally over. At 65, David's younger brother looked older than his age, gaunt, hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of financial ruin and the psychological toll of living like a fugitive in his own family's home. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. This was never supposed to go on this long." Looking at Robert Patterson, really seeing him for the first time in 5 years, I understood why David had felt compelled to help him. This wasn't the arrogant, manipulative man who'd borrowed money from us repeatedly and never paid it back. This was a broken person who'd lost everything and had nowhere left to turn. But understanding David's motivation didn't excuse his methods. "Robert, I'm not angry at you for needing help," I said, my voice steady with hard-won clarity. "I'm angry at both of you for deciding that lying to me was easier than trusting me with the truth." What emerged over the next 4 hours was a story of desperation, misguided loyalty, and the catastrophic consequences of choosing deception over difficult honesty. Robert's business had collapsed 18 months ago, leaving him with debts that went far beyond simple financial problems. He owed money to investors who weren't interested in payment plans or bankruptcy proceedings, people who'd made it clear that disappearing was his safest option. He'd been living in his car for 3 weeks when he finally swallowed his pride and called David. The original plan was temporary shelter, just long enough to figure out his next move, maybe save enough money to start over somewhere far from Portland. I told David it would be 2 weeks, maybe a month at most, Robert said, his voice heavy with shame. But every time I tried to leave, something went wrong. My car broke down, or I couldn't find work, or those people got closer to tracking me down. David had been supporting Robert financially while he lived in our basement, using money from our retirement accounts without my knowledge. The elaborate deception had grown month by month, becoming more complex as Robert's presence became harder to hide. The cleaning lady incident was our wake-up call, David admitted. We realized how close we'd come to being discovered, and I panicked. Instead of telling you the truth, I convinced myself that I could manage the situation by making you doubt what Chloe had seen. The systematic gaslighting hadn't been malicious, it had been desperate. David had watched me spiral into confusion and self-doubt, had actively encouraged my fears about memory loss and paranoia, because admitting the truth felt more terrifying than watching me suffer. I told myself I was protecting you, David said, his voice breaking. I thought if you knew Robert was here, you'd be frightened or angry, or you'd make us send him away when it wasn't safe. I convinced myself that a few white lies were better than putting you through that stress. But the few white lies had become an elaborate psychological manipulation that had nearly destroyed my confidence in my own perceptions. I gave them both an ultimatum that night, delivered with the authority of a woman who'd finally reclaimed her power in her own home. Robert had 48 hours to contact a lawyer, explore legitimate options for dealing with his creditors, and find alternative housing. I would help him research witness protection programs, debt consolidation services, even relocation assistance if necessary. But he could not continue living in our house like a ghost, and David could not continue lying to me to facilitate his brother's hiding. David's punishment was more complex and more personal. Our marriage could potentially survive his deception, but only if he committed to complete honesty going forward and professional counseling to address the paternalistic attitude that had made him think he could manage my reality without my consent. You treated me like a child, David, I told him as we sat in our living room at 2 a.m., exhausted by hours of painful truth-telling. You decided what I could handle, what I was allowed to know, what version of reality I should be living in. That's not protection, that's control. The healing process took months. Robert found a lawyer who helped him negotiate with his creditors and enter a debt management program that kept him safe while addressing his financial obligations. He moved to Oregon City, got a job at a hardware store, and began the slow process of rebuilding his life without hiding from his problems. David and I started couples counseling with Dr. Patricia Williams, a therapist who specialized in trust issues and communication breakdowns in long-term marriages. The sessions were brutal, confronting 45 years of patterns where David made major decisions unilaterally and I accepted them to keep peace. But somewhere in those painful conversations, we began to rediscover the partnership we'd lost along the way. David had to learn that protecting me didn't mean controlling information, and I had to learn that trusting him didn't mean accepting his judgment over my own perceptions. Sarah's engagement party happened 3 weeks later than originally planned. When we finally celebrated, it was in a house that felt genuinely safe for the first time in months, not because we'd eliminated all potential threats, but because we'd eliminated the lies that had made our own home feel dangerous. The most profound change wasn't in our marriage, though that grew stronger through the crucible of complete honesty. The most profound change was in me. For 3 weeks, I'd been told that my perceptions were unreliable, my memory was failing, my instincts were paranoid. I'd almost accepted that version of myself, the confused elderly woman who couldn't trust her own mind. But I wasn't confused, I wasn't paranoid, I wasn't losing my mind. I was living with someone who was systematically lying to me, and my subconscious had been trying to alert me to that deception in every way it could. The coffee mug was real, the security alerts were real, the displaced personal items were real. My sense that something was wrong in my own home was absolutely, completely real. What I learned is that gaslighting doesn't just make you doubt specific incidents, it makes you doubt your fundamental ability to navigate reality. When someone you trust tells you repeatedly that your perceptions are wrong, you begin to lose confidence in your most basic instincts. If you're watching this and something feels wrong in your own life, if someone you love is making you question your memory, your perceptions, your sanity, trust yourself. The people who truly care about us don't need to control our understanding of reality to protect us. Have you ever been made to feel crazy for noticing things that turned out to be real? Have you survived a relationship where your concerns were dismissed as paranoia or confusion? Share your story in the comments below, because every person who speaks up makes it harder for the next victim to be silenced by doubt. Subscribe to our channel if you believe in the power of truth over deception, the importance of trusting your own instincts, and the possibility of rebuilding relationships that have been damaged by lies. Because sometimes the most important stories are about ordinary people finding the courage to demand honesty from the people they love most. David and I will celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary next year. We've earned every day of those 5 decades, especially the last 5 years, since we learned to tell each other the truth, even when it's difficult. Robert visits for Sunday dinner once a month now, openly and honestly, as families should. He's rebuilt his life through hard work and accountability rather than hiding and deception. And I trust my own perceptions completely. Because I learned that the most dangerous intruders aren't the ones who break through windows. They're the lies that slip in through love and hide in the shadows of our most intimate relationships. Chloe Martinez was right to trust what she saw that day. The cleaning lady who barely knew our house could see clearly what I'd been trained to doubt: that someone was there who shouldn't have been. Sometimes it takes a stranger to help us recognize the truth we've been living with all along. Trust yourself. Your instincts are trying to protect you, even when the people you love are not.